On the 8th of September 2000, the General Assembly of the United Nations, after the 3-day Millennium Summit, have adopted the Millennium Declaration on Human Rights with ambitious objectives. It, among other things, it declared that men and women have the right to live in dignity, free from suppression, violence, hunger, and in this area, or in this situation, to raise their children. But reality looks different very often. I was in Sao Paulo recently. In the last year, there were 1,300 murders. That's 15 times more than in Germany. But nevertheless, there was a decrease of 70% last year. In Sao Paulo, there are 50,000 carjackings a year. And according to official statistics, the police of Sao Paulo shot 350 people dead during arrests. So the risk of being killed by the police is 1 to 200. State Secretary, Lord Mayor, Minister of the Interior, Congress President, ladies and gentlemen. In the Millennium Declaration that was mentioned at the beginning, the United Nations defines a series of quantified development objectives that should be reached, like a reduction of 50% of poverty, enabling children all over the world to be educated in school, and better health for children. In a few years, we will see whether these objectives are going to be reached. But already now, we have seen that these objectives will not be met. It is mentioned that everybody has the right to life free from violence and poverty. Child abuse, domestic violence, war traumas, gang crimes, etc., affect the most poor in society, the most poor around the world, with very negative consequences and repercussions. Very often, victims don't suffer only bodily harm, but also the risk of depression, social isolation, and drug addiction. We also know that this kind of violence is dangerous for social development and economic development. So is it possible to have or to set ourselves concrete targets, concrete objectives for crime prevention? Is it possible to reduce worldwide violence by 50%? What should we do in order to reach this target? How difficult is it to reach such a target? And which developments of the last 20 years give reason for optimism that we really can meet such a target? If we start working on concrete measures, if we want to have concrete prevention, then we need measurable target numbers on regional, national, and international level. This has become possible only recently, so that I want to present to you how such a violence prevention could look like in 3 areas. For the last few years, the office of, the UNODC C is gathering figures for crime statistic. For example, per year, 500,000 people are victims of murder and manslaughter. And a reduction by half would look like a reduction by 250,000 cases a year. And a second area where we now have good figures worldwide is domestic violence. And in the efforts of reduction of violence, this has to play a vital role. Last year, a study by Charlie Watts and Garcia Moreno was published, which summed up worldwide surveys about domestic violence. And it shows that worldwide 30% of women have once in their life at least become victims of violence. So if we calculate this for the worldwide female population, 750 million women throughout the world have been once a victim of domestic violence. A third kind of violence where we have figures is the victimization, the sexual victimization of children. A study by Pereda has in the year 2009 created this study with the conclusion that 20% of all women and 8% of all men have once been victims of violence, of abuse as a child. In Europe, the average number is 9%. In other parts of the world, it is even higher. What is important is that today we are in a situation where we can look at such figures, where these figures exist, so that we can see what a reduction by 50% means to us. So if we accept these initial data, then we have the conclusion, well, is this really is this really possible to enable? I think that it is realistic, and there are 4 good reasons for that, for a reduction within 35 years. First of all, we are already here. And with this, I mean that for all areas of violence where we have figures, there are already lots of countries where these target values are already met, or the numbers are even inferior. So we have also the means in order to reach these prevention targets. And I am conservative. Reduction by 50% within 35 years is a decrease by 1.7% a year, and that is much less than the reduction of the violence rate in Germany in the last 20 years. So it means that this is really plausible. And thirdly, we learn quickly. In the last 20 years, we have seen a lot of progress in understanding which forms of prevention make sense. We have better knowledge about what the reasons of violence are, and in the next 10, 20 years, this knowledge will still increase. And we have support. Steven Pinker said a few years ago that globally the tendency to violence has been decreasing worldwide. for several years. Of course, we should not extrapolate this development just as it is into the future, but it is important to keep that in mind, to see that globally the world is becoming better, so to speak, in terms of becoming more non-violent. This development is supported by a global development towards better prevention policies. What is happening here in Germany since 1995, with the first Prevention Congress, is part of a global development that I would like to illustrate briefly. The basis for that was made by, in 1996, by a resolution of the Security Council, where deliberate violence was really declared an official problem, and the coordination of the work began, and a few years later we had the global campaign for violence prevention, not only with a public health approach, but also with concrete measures, with concrete measures to take. And in the last 12 years, every 2 years, the World Health Organization has held congresses on violence prevention, and in the last 10 years, a lot of publications have been published, not only by the World Health Organization, but also the World Bank, the UNICEF, the United Nations Development Program, etc., that increasingly identify the problems of violence and prevention from violence. An important step in order to integrate national governments here will be, at the end of this year, the status report on violence prevention of the World Health Organization. This report will, for the first time, globally identify to which extent countries all around the world have implemented the standards that have been set, and on the basis of this, recommendations will be made to diverse countries around the world. These recommendations are not that important from the German perspective, but in a lot of countries these recommendations are really held in high esteem, and they influence the national development of crime policies. The Global Plan of Action by the Violence Prevention Alliance 2 years ago. This happened, in Munich. We had a discussion about that, for example, and several targets have been defined. Communication and advocacy have to be intensified. This is one target, and with this, the World Health Organization wants to extend further integration into national policies and international policies. National measure plans have to be developed, etc. There are 6 evidence-based strategies that are now in the center. Evidence-based education of parents. Here we have, for example, a free internet-based parent education program, programs for social competence, change of violence promoting standards and values, reduction of problematic alcohol consumption, reduction of risks of being victims of violence by shotguns. In Cambridge, we will be having a congress in cooperation with the World Health Organization in autumn, where we will be able to discuss the topic of my speech in a more intense way. we will invite several hundreds of international experts and analyze the strategies that we can really suggest internationally so that we can achieve a reduction by 50% in the next 35 years. Of course, I do not know what the results are going to look like, but I would like to present to you some considerations that we have already made. First of all, we need to establish resources in countries with low and medium incomes. I want to show you how big the problem is. This is a world map in which the countries are illustrated in the size proportionally to the volume of violent offenses. Please keep that in mind. And now a map showing how much science is produced by the countries. These are not specific data in connection with crime prevention, but these data this data shows how large the discrepancy is between countries where we have knowledge and countries where we have the biggest problems. So this is where we have to act. And secondly, the involvement of science in the civil society. The approach of the World Health Organization considers most of all the change of individuals. What we want to do during congresses like this is to look at other approaches, namely strengthening the civil society. We think that violence is not a problem of individual pathologies, but also a problem of a social order. And what we want to do is to try to consider how we can improve the efficiency of police, of social institutions, and promote the rule of law. And eventually, we have two further points. Ms. Steffen has illustrated the difference between prevention and repression, and she received an applause for that. But nevertheless, I want to stress that in this Congress we also want to focus the topic justice and police, because this is one of the biggest problems in those countries where we have a high violence rate, because there is not a security of justice and rule of law. So topics like a better formation of police, a better legitimization of police, a penal policy that is more appropriate in order to reduce violence, I think this should be a part of a good prevention policy. And the difference between prevention and repression, well, to make this difference is not that helpful. And eventually, we have the tradition of randomized controlled trials, evidence-based prevention. We want to complement it with another perspective. We have invited Steve Pinker, who will talk about our nature, the better angels of our nature, why violence has declined. We want to find out what are the characteristics of the people that we want to help, that we want to assist. There's empathy, self-control, morals, and reason in every person, and there are measures with which we can address these characteristics of every individual in order to reduce violence or the risk of violence. The Millennium Declaration of the year 2000, the General Assembly of the United Nations has formulated basic principles of rights. But nowadays, we still are far from reaching this target. The Millennium Declaration of the UN was nevertheless a great success in lots of sectors. The United Nations have defined development targets, and with that reached a mobilization of all social and political players in a lot of countries. There will be an assessment of the targets next year. We will see what has been reached, which goals have been reached, and where there are still gaps. I personally hope that the world community will also specify similar targets for violence prevention. A reduction by 50% within 35 years would lead to better situations or political economic situations as well in the affected countries. The Prevention Congress are a member of the Prevention Alliance that the World Health Organization supports in its effort to reduce violence globally. So therefore, I would like to give you an incentive. Wouldn't it be a good idea if the German Congress on Crime Prevention would stand behind the idea of naming, of identifying and setting concrete violence reduction targets? This year, there's a slide missing. Well, this year's priority topic is prevention requires practice, policies, and science. And the suggestion that I want to make would match up very well with this motto. Thank you very much for your attention.